Okay, this is chapter 1, part 3. And in this section, I want to talk a little bit about certain legal terms that are foundational in understanding the criminal justice, the legal approach to studying crime. And so we have here is a set of Latin terms. Our criminal justice system, our legal system specifically, was influenced a great deal by the ancient Romans. The Romans, 2,000 years ago, were very good at developing laws and, developing a complicated, formalized legal system. And so they were such an influential civilization that it's been passed down the generations in many countries, not just the United States, and much of Europe and other places. And so we have, if you are interested in going to law school, you might want to think a little bit about studying these Latin terms, because you certainly will get that heavily in law school. And so I want to run through some of these, and again, the ones we're focusing on here are sort of basic foundational ideas that go back to the Romans that are still with us and important today. This first one I have here is Nullum Crimen Sine Lege. And again, one advantage you'll have to learning these, and you need to know these for testing purposes, is if you happen to speak Spanish. Spanish is related to Latin, is descended from Latin, and so that gives you a little insider trick to remembering some of these words. But the literal translation of this would be that there's no crime without a law. So no behavior is criminal unless there's a law that prohibits it. So there could be some, say for example, somebody develops a new drug which didn't exist before, and it's on the streets or it's available. Maybe you could even buy it in stores because it hasn't been criminalized yet. It's too new. It hasn't come to the attention of the criminal justice system yet. And so it's being sold and passed around and consumed legally because of this principle here, that if you don't pass a law against it, it's not illegal. It may be harmful. It could be a risky or dangerous behavior or harmful behavior. But unless there's a law been passed, then it's not a crime. It's not criminal. So that's an old sort of this Roman concept that you can't, if somebody does something bad, you can't say, well, okay, off to jail you go, if there's no law that says that behavior is prohibited. So you got to go out and pass that law, get the law on the books, and then you can enforce the law after that point. Next point here. Nulla poena sine lege. So the poena here is that means punishment, and so you get words like the penology, which is the study of punishment, or there's other words in there too. I think maybe even penitentiary comes from this Latin word meaning a punishment. So what they mean by this term is that there is no punishment without the law. So it goes along with the first term up here. No punishment can be given by a court unless there is a law authorizing it. So just like with, you can't arrest somebody for behavior that doesn't go against any criminal law, you can't punish anybody. You can't lock up anybody for a crime that is not a crime yet, that is not on the books. There has to be a law that says this behavior is illegal, is criminal, and here is the punishment that should be given out for this criminal behavior. So again, it's this idea you can't go after people, prosecute and punish them unless there are laws authorizing you to do that. Okay, a couple of important terms here. This first one here is mala in se, and the next one is mala prohibita. Mala in se, again, this translated sort of word for word here would be like bad in and of itself. And what they mean by mala in se is that acts that are criminalized because they are inherently immoral. So, say the obvious example of something like homicide, murder. That would be a crime that's mala in se, because pretty much everybody agrees across cultures, across historical periods, that intentionally taking somebody's life without justification, not in self-defense or something like that, but aggressively intentionally taking somebody's life is a bad behavior, is a criminal, unacceptable behavior. Most everybody agrees with that. And so when it's something that's obviously bad like that, then they'll refer to it as being mala in si, something that's kind of obviously bad, seriously bad. This mala prohibida refers to acts that are criminalized only because the public has decided that they should be. So there's more of a focus on social agreement by the public that this needs to be criminalized and we need to try to stop it, but that may vary quite a bit from society to society, from historical age to historical age. So say, for example, something like, the use of smoking marijuana, that if you go back 100 plus years, that was something that was not illegal. Again, maybe more, not perfectly new, but something that hadn't been around forever and hadn't gotten the attention of authorities to go ahead and criminalize it. So it went from something that was legal that eventually became criminalized as people got worried about it and didn't like it. It became a criminal thing to possess or use or sell marijuana. And now fast forward to 2020, and we see that much of the country, state by state, is legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana possession and marijuana use, or at least allowing it for medical purposes. See, so that's an example of something that would be a behavior that would be mala prohibida, meaning that it's bad at certain times and places and periods because people don't happen to like it, they disapprove of it, they want it criminalized and prosecuted at certain times and places, but there's a lot of disagreement and variety there, so that is why they distinguish it with this term versus mala in si. Again, very basic foundational ideas that you get in criminal law. Of course, going along with this idea of this variety and variation in what's criminal and what's not criminal. Many definitions of crime are not completely universal. They evolve. So yes, it's there's sort of two sides to this. Yes, there's certain crimes that are almost always in all places considered to be bad and punishable, that deserving of punishment, like murder. But there's a lot of things. People's values vary from one culture to another, and people's values and attitudes do change over time too. They evolve, and so you got a little bit of a moving target there when we're talking about crime and what we mean by crime. Well, it depends a little bit on what society we're talking about, what time and place we're talking about. There is some variety there, and to give an example of that, the textbook cites an anthropological study of 110 societies, all different kinds of societies, more complex modern societies like ours, and maybe also some more tribal societies, that more ancient societies, and how those societies might compare with ours and what they see as being criminal. What they found in the study of 110 of these different sorts of societies was they found that incest and kidnapping or abduction of married women were universally punished. So in all these societies that they looked at, they found that, sexual relations with close relatives was universally thought to be bad criminal behavior. You shouldn't do that. Serious bad stuff. Also, this kidnapping of women, married women in particular, that across the board was universally punished. So other crimes were not, it kind of, was dependent on what you were focusing on. But other crimes were not 100%. It depended on the crime, and some societies there were differences. The vast majority of this sample of 110 societies, they punished rape of an unmarried woman, and you can see that in the vast majority of societies, adultery, cheating on your spouse, is considered a bad behavior that needs to be punished. In American society, it's not something that we criminalize and punish, but that's an example of behavior that surveys show that 95% of people think it's bad. It's immoral to cheat on your spouse. but we don't criminalize it. You don't go to jail for that. So there you see a difference between the morality, things that we think are wrong, and things that we think are serious enough, or the kind of problem that we need to go after and prosecute and punish for. And the way in 2020 we look at adultery is we don't see that as something that needs to be criminalized. But a lot of societies have looked at it that way. And also sort of seducing a sexually immature girl, underage sex, sort of the statutory rape sort of crimes were, in the vast majority of societies were, in this study, were unacceptable and thought to be, in need of punishment, that sort of bad behavior. So what's the bottom line there here? Bottom line is that that there's variety and there's also uniformity or universality. There's a lot of behaviors that people all around the world at different times and places recognize is bad. They don't like it. They want to criminalize it, want to punish it. But there's also a lot of variation. That there's not 100% agreement. There's not 100% agreement in the United States with what's bad and needs to be criminalized. So it's two sides of a coin there. And so we don't want to take it too far one way or the other and say, well, crime is, nobody can agree on what it is. Yeah, there's a lot of agreement on serious stuff, less agreement on the less serious stuff. Let's move to the next slide here. Of course, crime is not automatically enforced. Just because the laws are on the books doesn't mean that police officers are out there arresting a lot of people for committing those crimes. So there's a difference between the crimes on the books and what actually leads to arrests and punishment, and prosecution and punishment. And what you find in studies of the criminal justice system, especially in the United States, especially if you're focusing on law enforcement, is that the system tends to focus on two things. I put here that they tend to focus on the crimes that are the most serious. So if you have a homicide, a police department is going to devote a lot more time and energy on trying to solve that crime because it's so serious, compared to a lesser crime, less serious crime. So definitely more serious crimes are going to tend to receive more attention. But another thing that I don't list here that you should be aware of is that the criminal justice system also likes to go after crimes where they can be successful. They can catch guilty people. They can prosecute and successfully convict them. So they tend to go after crimes where they can get really good evidence against the defendant and where they can successfully prosecute. If it's a crime, even if it's a fairly serious crime, but it's one that's really hard to prove, it's hard to get the evidence, good strong evidence against the defendant, a lot of times they won't go after those as much and devote as many resources to that because they want to be successful. They want to catch the bad guys and successfully punish them. So, so there's certain sorts of crimes, for example, white collar, really sophisticated crimes committed by pretty smart, sophisticated criminals, a lot of times go undetected and go unpunished because it's harder to catch them. It's harder to get the evidence and prove your case. And so better to focus on crimes where you can, it's easier to make the case and get the convictions. So some of those white collar crimes can be very serious and hurt a lot of people, tens of thousands of people. But again, they don't always get the attention that they probably deserve because it's hard to successfully prosecute. Now, a couple of additional points here. These are just a lot of introductory points that are good to know. Most people have broken the law. If you look at surveys where you ask people, have you ever done any of these crimes? And you have a long list of crimes. Most people have done sometime in their life, usually when they're pretty young, teenagers and such. Are a lot of people have, most people have done something wrong, have committed maybe not a very serious thing. So on the one hand, here you've got two sides of a coin again. Most of us are not angels. Most of us have done maybe minor things, especially when you're young. So that's true. But at the same time, we don't want to think that there's no concentration of criminality, because there is. That you find research shows that the bulk of serious crimes, we're talking homicides, rapes, robbery, aggravated assault, grand theft auto, some of these more serious types of crimes, that it's usually a small minority of individuals, maybe 5% of the population, that will commit over 50%, 60, 70% of all of these serious crimes. So crime, even though in general, few of us are angels, if you're talking about serious crime, it tends to be concentrated in the hands of a small percent of the community or of the population. And so those folks are the ones that we have to be most concerned about, because they commit most of the serious crimes. Now, criminals are not as easy to what we want to call a quote unquote criminal is not as easy to identify as you might think, because even the most serious hardcore criminal is not committing serious crimes 24/7 every day, 7 days a week, every day, throughout every hour of the day, sort of thing. Crime tends to be, even among the most hardcore committed sort of criminal, it's kind of an occasional thing. A lot of times criminals follow opportunities. When they get an opportunity to make some easy cash illegally, they go for it. And so because of that, it's not like, even if you take the most serious, hardcore case, like a serial killer who's killed, dozens of people. Well, they've probably killed dozens of people, and this was a very high-profile case. They probably killed dozens of people over many years, and so most of the time they weren't killing people. Most of the hours of the day they weren't killing people, and so criminals a lot of times don't really seem to act a lot of the time much differently than the rest of us. So it's a little grayer and not as black and white as we might think what we would call a criminal and what we wouldn't call a criminal. So there's a little bit of grayness there. But again, we don't want to take that idea too far, because it is true that most of the serious crime is committed by a small percentage of people. So so again, there's two sides of the coin here. Now, the public tends to focus on one-to-one crimes, meaning a robbery in the street. Somebody comes up to you, sticks a gun in your face, and says, "Give me your valuables, or I'm going to shoot you." That kind of thing. That's terrifying. People worry. Obviously, no mystery and surprise that people worry about that sort of crime, or somebody breaking into their home, committing a home invasion, breaking into your home and terrorizing you. People. Usually homicides are one perpetrator and one victim. And so that's a very terrifying sort of crime. Rape, the same sort of thing. So these sorts of crimes that are one-on-one, face-to-face kind of crimes really scare people, and we tend, both in the media and public attention, and also in the discipline of criminology, we tend to focus on those, what we call a lot of times serious street crimes. We tend to focus on those the most. We don't focus so much on the white-collar crimes that I mentioned before, the sophisticated, business sort of crimes, because again, they're complicated enough and removed enough, and not as dramatic as the face-to-face, the gun in the face kind of thing, that they just don't grab people's attention like these dramatic face-to-face crimes do. So that's sort of a bias in the system, is that we tend to, and not for understandable reason, that we're really concerned about burglary and rape and homicide, but because of that, there's less focus on other sorts of crimes, like, for example, less focus on prostitution or drug sales, even though we do focus on drugs quite a bit. What I mean by that is the type of crime that's like a business transaction where there's no obvious victim: prostitution, selling sex for money, selling drugs for money. Those sorts of crimes tend to get a little bit less attention too, because you don't have an obvious victim like you do with a homicide victim or that kind of a thing, or like gang wars and people killed, drive-by shootings, and bystanders being killed and that kind of stuff. That gets a lot more attention. So that's what we mean by this focus on one-to-one crimes. Now, just a couple. I don't want to spend a lot of time covering, there's quite a bit in the chapter about sort of research methods, the kind of data that we use in criminology. I don't want to get into that too much. Again, this class is not a research methods class. It's not a technical class, so I don't want to take it very far. I don't put it in the notes here, but you should know that the main sources of where we get our data from is we get our data from police records is a major source, what we call official records, to study crime in different aspects of the criminal justice system. We also use what's called self-report data, where you get a survey and we ask you a bunch of questions. Have you ever done this bad thing before? Have you done this bad thing before? And trust that people will be honest to admit certain bad things that they've done. Actually, those self-report surveys end up being more reliable and more honest and trustworthy than you might think. So that's a major type of data that we use, as the simple self-report survey sort of thing. And then also another major source is we talk to victims and ask victims a lot of questions like, okay, have you been a victim of a crime the past 6 months? What happened? What crimes happened to you? What was the perpetrator like? Tell us about the perpetrator. What were the circumstances of the crime? So asking victims about crimes is a very important way that we study crime too. And there's lots of big surveys and stuff that I'm not going to get into now that are where we use this data a lot to learn what's going on out there in terms of crime and criminals. But those are some of the major sources that we use. I don't want to take it any further than that right now. Let me say that one thing I did want to mention is they talk about crime rates all the time. And by rates, we mean, as you see in the note here, standardized measure that allows comparisons of groups of different sizes. So I thought that's important to stress, just because you run across these tables and graphs all the time. And one important thing to be able to understand to make sure that you don't get misled or get inaccurate ideas about things is that you need to understand this use of rates. And so I think the best way to explain this is with an example. You might, for example, be looking at Pocatello, and you'll see that I'll just use hypothetical numbers, that in 2019 there were 3 homicides in Pocatello in 2019, and then you're thinking about moving someplace else. You get a job opportunity in, say, Los Angeles, and you go look at the stats for Los Angeles, and you see, oh, last year, same period of time, you had 500 homicides in Los Angeles. So you think to yourself, well, I don't want to go to Los Angeles because that's a much more dangerous place. You have a lot higher risk of being murdered in Los Angeles than Pocatello, because look at over here in Pocatello, you just had a couple. Over there in Los Angeles, you had hundreds. And so that seems like a much more dangerous place. But that's an inaccurate way of thinking about it, because of course Los Angeles is going to have a lot more homicides than Pocatello, because it's such an enormous high population place. It's a huge metropolitan area with millions and millions of people that live there. So just by virtue of having so many people there, of course you're going to have more homicides. Pocatello is a little place, just tens of thousands of people here. And so to be able to decide which place is more dangerous, which place am I going to have a higher risk of being killed, you need to look at the homicide rate, because what that rate does, like it says in the definition here, the rate fixes the problem. It fixes the problem that Pocatello is little and Los Angeles is huge. To be able to compare apples and apples, fair comparison, you use a rate because it adjusts for this population size difference. Pocatello is little, Los Angeles is big. And so you go look at the homicide rates and you say, oh, I see Pocatello has a rate of 2 people killed per 100,000 people in the population last year, say 2019 or something like that. You say, okay, 2, so it's the homicide rate of 2 per 100,000. Then you look at Los Angeles, say, oh, Los Angeles has a homicide rate of 10 per 100,000 people that live in Los Angeles. So 10 over there, 2 over here. So Los Angeles, it turns out, is 5 times more dangerous, 10 versus 2, 5 times more dangerous than Pocatello. So am I comfortable with that higher level of risk? because they're from those comparing those rates. Now we're comparing apples and apples, and it does look like I was thinking before. Now I know for sure that Los Angeles is a more dangerous place to be. That the risk of being shot or being killed is significantly higher. To be specific, 5 times higher. So rate, you always want to keep this in mind when you don't. Generally speaking, you don't want to look at raw numbers and say, oh, 500 homicides over here and 3 over here. You want to look at homicide or your crime rates, because then you can compare this place with that place, or that group with this group with that group, that sort of thing. So, another example of this would be if you were comparing a majority, looking at race, ethnicity, comparing a majority group with a minority group. Well, that's not apples to apples, because one group is big and the other one is small. So you need to look at rates to be able to compare groups on an apples to apples accurate basis. So rates is usually going to be the thing you want to look at. Okay. Clearance rate that's how many crimes get solved, the percentage of cases that get solved, because that's a big number. An important issue is, if someone is murdered, do we catch the guilty? Do we catch the person for it? And so this is a statistic that's out there, is what percentage of crimes get solved, and they call that the clearance rate. You see on the next slide here that you see the percent, which this is a graph showing the clearance rates for different sorts of crimes in the United States. And so it's showing the percentage of, if there's a crime, what's the chance that the person gets caught. And you see with murder, that it's about 61.6%, rounded up to 62% of the time they catch the person, they solve the case, which means that almost 40% of the time, 38% of the time, they don't get a conviction, or at least an arrest of somebody for the crime. You can see that rape is something that very often people do not get convicted of it. It's a crime that often the perpetrators get away with it. Only half the clearance rate is, say, 35%. So only 35% of the time does the crime get solved. Robbery, I'm just rounding here, robbery, 30%. So a lot of time robbers get away with it. Aggravated assault, a lot of times it doesn't get solved, or less than half the time. You can see that violent crimes are more likely to be solved than nonviolent property crimes, because with violent crimes, a lot of times they're done in the heat of the moment, and impulsive crimes, and there's witnesses, there's surviving victims who testify. But when people commit big burglaries or thefts or steal cars, they do it in a sneaky way. It's stealth, so there's less likely to be witnesses, or maybe perhaps video recordings of what's happening. So you see burglars and thieves and auto thieves are quite likely to get away with it, because you can see that only, say, 19% of these people are getting caught. So this is one problem with our system, is that a lot of times these criminals get away with it, and because, hey, if we don't have sufficient evidence, we're not going to be able to get an arrest, get a conviction. And so you can see that that's a problem, that especially with certain crimes, a lot of people are getting away with it. And finally, these are both graphs that I've just pulled from the chapter to, again, illustrate things that I think are interesting and things to think about. And here's a little bit of something that I'd like you to think about. Is you see here a graph in the trends of violent crime in the United States, going all the way back to 1989 and then up till 2017. So that's the newest numbers they had. The statistics are always behind. But here you see that the violent crime rate was much higher in the late 80s and early 90s, and then it dropped significantly, really all the way, with a few ups and downs along the way, has dropped to the present day. That the violent crime is just a fraction. Say if it's around 400 per 100,000 people here in 2017, well, it was up 750 or so back in the early 90s, so almost twice as much violent crime back then as compared to now. This is something you may not be aware of, because the news, you don't want to go to news for for information on crime trends because they make it seem like things are always getting worse and that crime's out of control. But actually, violent crime's been improving for 30 years, for over 20 years, 25 years anyway. It's been coming down for a long time and flattened out. Just very recently, in the last, you see there a little bump in 2016 and 17, and then you're seeing a little bit of bump currently as we speak in 2020. But the overall big picture here is that crime has come down. Violent crime has come down a lot in the recent decades. And I won't talk about it right now. Maybe it'll come up later because it's a big discussion. But this is an example of something that a criminologist someone like me might try to do, is try to figure out, well, what the heck happened in the 90s and the last couple of decades that brought down the violent crime so much. And if we can figure that out, then we can continue that and try to bring crime down even further. But one thing I'd like you to do is just sort of a thinking exercise is why do you think that this violent crime has come down so much in recent decades? Does that surprise you, first of all? And what do you think happened over the past few decades that the violent crime has dropped almost in half? Anyway, let's finish up with the chapter right on this point, and then we'll start up later and get into chapter 2.